Hello again, it's Kiri. I have now completed the first part of the tutorial where I showed you how to create this pattern. Thank God this is now much shorter. The first part is much shorter now, so I hope I can upload it a bit easier so that my iPad doesn't break. So now that we've kind of showed you how to create this pattern, I can basically delete that and go ahead and start with the actual pattern that I posted, which is this lovely pattern, the Christmassy one. I think this might be a bit easier to kind of comprehend because it has actual objects that people can recognize. So when you see them moving around to the four corners, it will make a little bit more sense why we're doing things and why we push things to the different directions. But I wanted the part one for kind of mostly technical reasons. As I said in part one, sometimes in the tutorials that I've watched, people would just do things without explaining the rationale behind them. So I hope that part one is clear in terms of, when I put the numbers around so you can see how patterns are moving around and why we're doing things. But yeah, anything that doesn't make sense, feel free in the comment section when I post it already to just ask questions and we can go into as much detail as you want. So this is the part where I will be recreating this pattern from scratch. As I said, we have the finished patterns here, so you can see that. Now the building block makes sense. Remember when we finished with the previous design where you saw the circle in the middle and the numbers, this now is the equivalent of that. So this is now the first kind of starting pattern that will then get repeated to create the kind of Christmassy pattern. So in order to do that, we have the individual pieces here, as I said. So this is the full composition. No, it's not. Yeah, so this is the present in the middle. As I said in the beginning, this flower I didn't end up using because I think it looks a bit kind of out of this universe that we have created here. And that's another kind of tip that I've learned, in terms of pattern creating. Sometimes something is off with my patterns and I'm like, what is it? Something doesn't make sense. And sometimes it's the objects that you've put together don't belong, let's say, in the same universe is the only, I guess, like professional technical way to describe it. I'm sure there's a word for that. I just don't know what that word is. But like when you see all the elements together, this kind of red flower seems a bit off, at least to me. Maybe you like it and you're now hating that I didn't include it in the design. I don't know, but I didn't like that, so I removed that. So we have the individual pieces here. As I said, we have the box, we have the berry, we have the pine cone and the branch. So now we will attempt to literally repeat the same process. We have the guide here. The guide can stay because it's literally in the center of the canvas. But now we want to create and put the composition of all of the elements to kind of live within these borders, right? We don't want anything going outside of the border, at least not massively. We don't want, it's not going to be a huge problem if like a little bit of the branch is going outside of the borders. That's fine. Sometimes actually experienced pattern designers, they kind of want that because that creates, makes it a bit harder to see what's the repeating block. But again, for me, for us, the beginners, I would like to keep things within the borders as much as I can. So let's start with the box. Oh, sorry. Another important tip when you have actual objects, I move the guide below and underneath the elements, because then you can check the kind of color combos and it's not, you don't have a layer on top of that to mix it up, right? So with the box, even though I think it's in the middle of the canvas as is, yeah, it looks like it's in the middle of the canvas. It's not looking like it's in the middle of the border that we've created. So this is where we start kind of getting creative. We click the arrow. Now the snapping needs to be off because you want that flexibility to move things around a bit in a more kind of free way. And I think my mind, my ADHD mind wants to align, kind of push it a bit further up and maybe align that with this bit up here, maybe like that. Again, that's personal preference, up to you. As I said, we can make it a bit bigger as well, so that it kind of aligns there. Again, this is now not in the center of the canvas, but it feels a bit more organic to be more in the center of the guide that we have created, right? Let's go with the other option, the berry. So with the berry, again, we can be creative size-wise. We can play around with it. I think there's a little bit of space to make it bigger. Maybe turn it around a little bit like that and see if, are we hitting the borders? Let's play around with it a bit. Okay. And then I have it here. And I think it would look, as you've seen the final pattern, but I moved it on the other side as well. So it's good to maybe kind of create a little bit of a symmetry within this canvas, because when you repeat that, again, it kind of creates that illusion. And if, for someone who's seeing the pattern for the first time, it's a bit like, oh, where does the pattern start? What is the repeating block? So it becomes a little bit more interesting, let's just say. So the easiest way to do that, we duplicate that. Again, arrow, snapping. Actually, you can turn on the snapping here, and I'll show you why. Because you can then align it a bit better with the other berry, right? So you don't want alignment in the middle, but when you move it like that, you see alignment with the other berry. So it's kind of there. And then maybe you can flip horizontally, and then again, you can check if it's within the borders. Yes, it is. All right, so these are now kind of aligned on the same height. Again, they're not aligned in the center, but they're aligned in the context of that design. So they live in that world in alignment, if that makes any kind of sense. Let's go to the branches. Now the branch is on the border. You see that this area is now off. So we need to fix that, and we need to move it. Oops, snapping off. You saw what the problem was with that. If you keep snapping on, you don't have that freedom to make kind of smaller movement. It's almost like the alignment and the snapping dictates the movement that you're going to make. So you don't want that when you're trying to fit that, kind of put it in a nice space so that it fits, right? So you don't want that. Let's put it down here a bit. And as I said, if it's not fully out of so like this area is out, it's a tiny area that kind of goes outside the border. It shouldn't be a huge problem. So it's fine for now. Let's repeat that, but we can always test that when we get to the final design. So right, we duplicate the branch. Oops. We turn it around. And we have a similar treatment over here. So they are not touching, but again, they kind of live in the same world, not aligned, not kind of touching any other object. And then the final piece is this thing at the top. Again, now we have a lot of space to make it bigger, right? So let's play around with that. Perfect. So we have that block now. Everything is kind of relatively within the border. We have created that. And now we can go ahead and merge some of these elements together. Before we do that, and this is very, very important, before we start merging these things together, I prefer to duplicate these things. So we duplicate the present. So this one is the duplicate. Let's duplicate one of the berries. You'll see, it will make sense. I promise it will make sense later. We duplicate, you only need one of its elements. You don't want everything that you see in the composition. You only need one version of these elements and then one of the branches. Now, what have we done here, right? Let me hide everything else. So you have the present and a duplicate present. We have the two berries that are part of the composition, but we also have a separate berry, right? So I'll leave the areas that are part of the composition. You have the pine thing at the top, but we also have a duplicate one. And then you have the two branches, but also a duplicate branch that's kind of hiding. We want that, and I'm gonna pick them all. So one branch, one pine thing, one berry, and one box, and I'll put them in a separate group, right? And the reason we're doing that, and this is our separate group, is, and I usually call that group, let's see, yep, the pine, the two berries, and the box. Yeah, so this is kind of my, let's rename it to kind of backup. So we want that because just in case we want one of these elements to bring it back into the design later on, and I will show you in which kind of where that would be necessary. If we need that individual design, we won't have to design it from scratch, because now what we have is the box that's part of the composition that will be the final block. We have the two berries that are now aligned. We have the pine thing at the top and the two branches that all of them live within the border, and that will be our block, right? So we can pinch these things together. And in fact, we can now remove that and put it kind of as a, actually we don't even need that to be part of that group. Let's move that completely outside so it lives by its own. Yeah, so this is now the repeating block, right? Why do we need that? We need that for we need the backup elements, because when you see here, and similarly to what happened with part one of the design, I can already tell that when we will move these things around in the same way, there will be some gaps between the design. So I think this area, oops, this area, oh, come on. Yep, this area might be a bit empty. I think this area might be a bit empty. So then if that happens, we can go back to our backup folder and copy and duplicate individual pieces. Let's say maybe one of the berries. We make it smaller and we make it fit here when we have the first repeating block that we will create in a second. So you don't have to then kind of rushing through to kind of create, copy that bit, recreate that, move it around. You don't have to deal with all of that. But let's see if that's the case, and I'll show you kind of how I tackle that in the future. So we don't need the guide anymore. And what we do now is we duplicate these 5 times like we did before. I do a 6th one just in case, so that I have the original one hidden. Just in case, let's say something happens in the design and the patterns are all over the place and we need the original block, okay? We now go, we start with the second layer. We do what, see, mistake. Let me delete all of them and do that from the beginning, because we forgot to put our green guides at the top, which meant that if I attempted to move that and duplicate that and move that around, what we're going to have only the elements that have a design within them moved around, and we don't want that in a pattern. In a pattern we want symmetry, right? So we go here, we do our green markings at the top, and now we duplicate that, and we want 1, 2, 3, 4, we want 5 duplicates, right? Let's hide everything else. And similarly to what we did with part 1, second layer, we click the arrow. Snapping definitely needs to be on this time. And as you saw, when I click the arrow, the whole canvas is now picked up, right? So we move all the way to the left until we see the orange cross in the middle, and all the way to the top until we see the orange cross. Perfect. Same with the second layer, arrow, whoops, we need to pick that, reveal that. Second layer, we click the arrow all the way to the left and then all the way to the bottom until we see. Perfect. Let's erase that at this stage so it doesn't become complicated later on. We go to the third arrow all the way to the top until we, oops, there we go, the orange cross in the middle, and then all the way to the right until we see both orange crosses appearing. Let's come here and delete that, that's fine. And then the last part, arrow all the way to the bottom until the orange cross appears, and all the way to the right. Oh, did I go too far? Yeah, we're fine. Perfect. And the last piece is the central piece that we left. Let's now go and delete our guide because we don't need that anymore. So these are now the things that will repeat it. Remember what I told you before we put the green guides. This area now feels a bit empty, and this area also feels a bit empty. So if that bother the hell out of us at this point and we don't want that, we could potentially go into the backup piece, duplicate, let's say, I'm not going to do that because I know it's going to look ugly, but we could potentially duplicate this berry, drag it all the way to the top, right? Reveal it and then try to manipulate it. So like, let's say we remove the snapping. I'm not going to do it. I already know it's going to look ugly, but we could make it tiny and kind of small and try to fit it in this segment here. See what I mean? So if we hadn't kept the original elements separate, you would have to come here, click this, the freehand kind of inclusion, and copy this whole thing, and then you'd be like, oh, now I'm having part of the box over here. It would have been a mess. So that's why we keep the individual elements separate, because then if you need to bring some of these designs here, you can easily kind of bring them in, but I'm not going to do that. I don't need that. The other thing that I've seen a lot of pattern designers do is once you have all of the designs, you can click and pick one of the colors from here and maybe do like dots. So you fill the gaps with something with the color that's part of the composition. Again, I don't like that. But if you see a gap and you don't like it, you can kind of do that. So now you have these dots that kind of live in that space and they're there. Again, I don't like that for this design. I want it to be, you know, the space here doesn't bother me as much, okay? Perfect, so we have this central piece. And again, another test could be, you see half of the composition is in the top two layers, the other half is in the bottom layers, and this is our backup original composition. So we pinch the top bits together. Let's check what we've pinched together. So it's this one, and now we duplicate that 4 times, okay? And we start the pushing process. So like pushing it to the top corner. Again, the arrow is on, snapping needs to be on, and then we're pushing it all the way up until we see the orange cross in the middle. The same process for this layer, arrow all the way to the bottom left. The arrow is on, snapping on, we're pushing it all the way to the top right. And then for the last square, we're pushing this all the way to the bottom right, okay? and you have your first repeat. This is your first repeat, it's done. You can again pinch them all together and you have the kind of a smaller scale of your original repeat, which is that big, and you can have this one now. As I said, at this stage you can kind of experiment with the background. As I said, by keeping the background layer, like if I remove that, this has no background. Okay, so now you can come here and decide and have many options how you want to kind of export that. You want to go kind of, even that, for example, some people might go completely kind of bold and in your face. I chose something a bit more, you know, similar kind of composition and color palette with the rest of the elements. But yeah, this is the scale number one, and you can keep repeating that process as many times as you want. As you saw, we can repeat that process. And again, arrow, snapping zone, pushing it to the top left, second layer, bottom left, third layer, top right, fourth layer, bottom right. Okay? Same pattern, smaller scale, right? I think this scale might be a bit too small for my design. I like the kind of hand-drawn elements when they are, let's say, in this pattern, when they are on this scale, that this is kind of the one I made earlier. I like this version, but then again, it depends on how you're going to use it. Some of the tools, when you upload these, let's say, to kind of create something in a print-on-demand browser, will give you the option to even upload this pattern, so the original repeating block, and they give you the functionalities and the options to click enable pattern. There's an option like that, and then you can choose the kind of pattern you can see. So you only need to upload this version on that kind of big as that, and then you can check and play around with the pattern. Some other tools will kind of require you to add the scale in the pattern that you want, and that's it. It's one upload, that's it. They don't give you the functionality to create the pattern. But again, I've showed you now how to do a very simple pattern. This is part 2 of like this Christmassy decoration. I kind of, when I was creating that, I was envisioning like a wrapping paper situation, or like a pattern for a Christmas bag, for a present. But the principles of how you create this pattern, how you play around with that, they're the same. You don't have to change the principles. So no matter what kind of design you're doing, how you're doing it, it's the same thing, and you can kind of be creative with that. You start with the border, you create everything in the middle, kind of as a repetition to see. So you create everything in the middle, and then you push things around until you have the pattern that you want. So that should be end of part 2. As I said, any question, anything that, you know, and you want any clarifications on, feel free to ask me. If I cannot put these tutorials on Reddit directly, I might put them, I guess I'll have to create a YouTube channel now and put them there. But yeah, thank you so much for all the lovely comments I've received. Let me know if you have any questions. And if this is something that you would like me to explore more. I know that there's like a million ways to do patterns. There's like the square method, there's the half drop, there's another way of doing patterns where you kind of messing the alignment intentionally, so it becomes a little bit more of a complicated pattern. In fact, some of the most kind of common patterns, like the little, you know, squares or like a chessboard or lines, are patterns that are repeated in a certain way, and it gives you like, you know, I don't know, like a chessboard pattern. We can play around with that if that's something that you'd be interested in, and I can show you how to do that. I guess I'll have to find out how to do it first, and then and then I can show you how you guys can do it. But yeah, that's all from me for now, and let me know how you found it. And yeah, thank you so much.